Now, I have to say a few words about this remarkable gentleman. Justice Cameron was appointed as an acting judge by President Mandela and later as a judge of the High Court. From 1999 to 2000, he served as acting justice at the Constitutional Court, the highest court of South Africa on constitutional matters. In this role, he took on the delicate and oftentimes perilous role of guarding the Constitution, dealing exclusively with constitutional matters that raise questions about the application and the interpretation of the Constitution. In 2000, he was appointed as a judge of appeal in the Supreme Court of Appeal, the very highest court in respect of all other matters, a role in which he hears and decides appeals against any decision of a high court. He also serves as General Secretary to the Rhodes Trust for South Africa. Now, reaching this apex should be an inspiration for all of us because in many ways it is a natural progression in this brilliant career, but it is a journey that few of us can say we've been on. It began when he joined the Johannesburg Bar in 1983, and he ultimately decided, like many lawyers, to devote his practice to safeguarding human rights. However, his journey has not been without personal hardship. As a young child, he was placed in a children's home with his two sisters. His mother, despite her own poverty, managed to secure placement for him in an excellent government high school. Ah, the power of education. Attending Pretoria's boys' school was a life-changing experience for young Cameron, and he went on to study law and language at Stellenbosch at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and at the University of South Africa, winning top academic honors in these esteemed institutions. It was perhaps his diagnosis with AIDS in 1997 that stands as the most formidable challenge that he has faced. As a white man with the benefit of a judge's salary, he was able to get the most improved, most advanced treatment, and with the benefit of medical science, his health improved. Yet seeing the disproportionate effect of AIDS on black South Africans and the accompanying toll on their health without the benefit of adequate medical care led to certain eventual death, he knew he could not remain silent. As the first senior South African official to publicly state his diagnosis of HIV/AIDS, Justice Cameron was selected as a recipient of the Nelson Mandela Award for Health and Human Rights. During his professorship at the Center for Applied Legal Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, he co-drafted the Charter of Rights on AIDS and HIV, co-founded the AIDS Consortium, and served as the first director of the AIDS Law Project. This great man has traveled the world meeting with national leaders and delivering lectures far and wide to rich and poor to raise public awareness of this disease and the inequalities that persist stubbornly throughout our society. We're very privileged to have with us tonight this preeminent legal scholar, this champion of human rights, gay rights, and health rights. Please join me in welcoming Justice Edwin Cameron.
Thank you very much. That is lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chancellor Zebos. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for braving the damp and the cold and the rain. I really appreciate your being here. And of course, in Africa, rain is a blessing. So the rain this afternoon was a good portent. And I want to say what a delight it is to be in Tennessee, to be in Nashville, and especially to be at Vanderbilt. It's been a long journey here in many ways. It started at the wedding of Samar Ali, whom Chancellor Zebos mentioned, 18 months ago when Frank Garrison said, "You've got to come to Nashville." And 10 days after the wedding, I received an email from Frank Garrison saying, "I've spoken to Chancellor Zebos, when are you coming?" And 18 months later, I'm here with you this evening. And I've been surrounded by your warmth, by your interest, your engagement. I've met a range of people in your city and in your state and on your campus over the last week. And it's been a great joy to be here. So I feel privileged. I'm honored to be delivering a Chancellor's lecture. And I want to get to the point where you can give me your inputs as well. I want to tell you a story which I think is an engaging and important story. It's a story about a virus. It's a story about an epidemic. It's a story about our frailty as human beings, about our weaknesses, about our shameful inability to deal with difficult things in our society and in ourselves. But it's also a story that tells the power of transcendent hope, the power of our ability to regulate our own affairs in ways that enable us to be better than ourselves. And for me as a lawyer, Chancellor Zebos, that's the most important part of the story. I speak to you tonight as someone whom Chancellor Zebos has already explained, lives with the virus, but is also a judge in the highest court of a country which, like your country, like your region, like your state, comes from a history of shameful racial injustice. And the power of change we have found in a commitment to a visionary constitution. And the story of how those two intersected, a deathly virus, a shameful inability to cope with it, and the power of legal reason, legal institutions, and the rule of law, is what I want to spend the next 25 or 30 minutes on before we get to your questions. So I thank you for being here. It's going to be interesting. And I want to start by going back in history, going back 32 years to when the virus was identified for the first time in your country amongst men like myself, gay men, men in the peak of their careers, young gay men who were stricken by an inexpressible calamity, an unknown virus for which medical science could do nothing. And you had a president elected in 1980 who was deeply conservative, disapproved of what was called the gay lifestyle. And as the death toll rose amongst gay men in your country and on your continent, President Reagan maintained a silence, a studied silence, a silence that said everything it was meant to say. It said, "You are getting what you deserve." President Reagan first uttered the word AIDS in 1987. He had a very fine Surgeon General, by the way, Dr. Everett Koop, who died recently, and I want to pay tribute to him, to the power of his rationality in a deeply homophobic and AIDS-phobic government. Dr. Everett Koop stood out. That virus came into my own life in 1985, and I was diagnosed with it in 1986. It was a moment of dreadful mortification. I was a young lawyer at the Witwatersrand Center for Applied Legal Studies, a human rights institution. It was an exciting and difficult time to be a human rights lawyer in South Africa. Apartheid was seeking to perform itself through grand apartheid, through repression. Repression was growing. There were ugly incidents, and internal dissent was rising. And the courts played a crucial role in mediating the extremities of apartheid law enforcement, sometimes moderating them. And it was interesting and exciting and challenging. And in the middle of this, I got a diagnosis of death. Because in December 1986, when I got my diagnosis, there was nothing that you could do for someone with HIV. But worse than being diagnosed with a deathly illness that foretold my early death, I was in my early 30s before I would turn 40, before there was any prospect of democracy. Much worse than that was the stigma that was associated with HIV. It was perhaps the most profoundly stigmatized disease in human history. There have been other diseases that have been heavily stigmatized, like the plague in 14th century and 15th century, early 15th century Western Europe. Leprosy, diseases have been rightly stigmatized for fear of contagion. Even though by the mid to late 1980s, studies from the San Francisco General Hospital had shown conclusively that it was very difficult to transmit HIV. Nevertheless, the stigma remained profoundly high, and it pervaded governance. It pervaded public management of the disease. Your states, and I'm afraid Tennessee amongst them, has got some of the severest laws against non-disclosure, against exposure of HIV, very, very heavily penalized laws which are directly related to the irrational stigma surrounding this virus. I experienced that stigma in a deeply personal way that impelled me not to speak about the virus. It was something which many people diagnosed with HIV experience. The difficulty of talking about infection with the virus. I went into a profound period of personal grief and difficulty for 3 years. I could speak to almost no one about my diagnosis. I thought it was to do with the fact that I contracted HIV homosexually. I'd come out as a gay man after struggling with my own sexuality for most of my life, after a marriage, after dating girls all my life. I'd come to realize that I had to build my own life on what was true within myself, and my sexuality was as much a part of myself as my gender, as my race, as everything else about me. And I came out proudly at about the time that I started my legal practice in Johannesburg. And then within a year or two, I became infected with HIV, and I felt an almost inexpressible mortification about that. Homosexual activity was not only illegal in South Africa, but it was persecuted. And here I was speaking out for gay and lesbian equality together with my other human rights work. But I'd become infected with this deeply stigmatized virus. But I was wrong. It wasn't to do with homosexual transmission, because my work took me to meeting people who were so different from myself. People who weren't white, people who weren't male, people who weren't gay, people who weren't middle class like myself. I met the wives of African mine workers who came to me in my practice, not because they knew that I had HIV. I was still keeping that a dread and deeply reclusive secret. They came to me as a lawyer, and they spoke to me in human terms of an identical fear of condemnation, rejection, revilement, and judgment, which is the essence of stigma. The most difficult part of stigma, of course, is its internalization. I was saying to one of your classes yesterday morning, very interesting class with medical students and researchers, that one of the unspoken parts of this epidemic, the under-researched parts, has been the way in which stigma has got internalized, and the way in which the internal stigmatization manifests itself in difficulties with prevention, with access to testing and to treatment and to care. There's certainly enacted stigma, which is the external manifestation of stigma, but the more difficult part is the part that one internalizes as someone with HIV. And I could see that these women, so different from myself and their husbands, because I was working with the National Union of Mine Workers, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, devising AIDS policies, taking AIDS discrimination cases as a lawyer, and yet not talking about it, keeping my secret deeply repressed. The epidemic in your country was almost overwhelmingly homosexual. And the public health specialists, including Dr. Everett Koop, feared that it would become a general epidemic. There were many indications that it would be, and public health campaigns were mounted to warn people of the dangers, to encourage safer sex. But it never happened in Western Europe, never happened in South Asia, never happened anywhere else in the world, South America, North America, that a generalized epidemic of HIV prevalence occurred. But it happened in Africa. By the time I was infected with HIV, by the time I learned my diagnosis, the epidemic in Africa was already the preponderant epidemiological manifestation of the disease. In Central Africa, whole villages were being wiped out because of a deadly disease, an identical virus, but amongst a black, poor, heterosexual population. And as we approached a change in the repression of apartheid, which I'd fought as a human rights lawyer, on the 2nd of February 1990, President de Klerk at long last announced the willingness of the apartheid government to move towards democracy. At that very time, the virus was taking hold in the population at the southern tip of Africa. A prevalence of under 2% in 1990, which was 5% by 1994, when we became a democracy under a constitution that guaranteed equality, a constitution that uniquely in the world at that time, a world first, included protection for sexual orientation. And as a proudly and openly gay man, I was appointed at the end of that year by President Mandela as a judge of the High Court, a fulfillment of my dreams. Never believed that I would become a judge, never believed that I would live so long, never believed that I would see democracy in South Africa, and I thought that was privilege enough. And I hope to remain healthy, I hope to remain well, but the disease, of course, caught up with me. Apart from a tiny fraction of 1% of people, everyone who's infected with HIV sooner or later falls severely ill with AIDS. And by 1997, at the end of the year, I was very, very sick with AIDS, with PCP in both my lungs, severe gastrointestinal thrush, and heavy loss of my body mass. I'd lost 15 kilograms. I was down to about 80 kilograms. And I was going to die. And I was going to follow the fate of many millions of Africans and 250,000 gay Americans at that point. That was what I was facing. But the most moving experience of my life, the most extraordinary event in my life by far, was having my life given back to me in November 1997 when I was able to start on antiretroviral medication. An extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen, the one that I think of when I'm here, when I travel to Tennessee, when I hear Chancellor Zebos speaking. It's an extraordinary experience of facing the certainty of death and experiencing its effects in your breathing, in your inability to consume or digest food, in the wasting away of your body, and then astonishingly, joyfully, surprisingly, to feel the life forces returning, to feel your appetites and your energies and your drive for life returning. And the sense of gratitude that that gave me impelled me after the death of a very brave Zulu-speaking woman called Gugu Dlamini, who spoke about her HIV in December 1998 and was killed by the members of her own community for doing so. 3 weeks later, after she spoke on the 1st of December 1998, Gugu Dlamini was murdered. She lived in a township called Umlazi on the outskirts of Durban. Unlike me, she didn't have a job. She didn't have constitutional protections against dismissal. She didn't have a middle-class income or a suburban home or a palisade around her house like I had. And I felt ashamed that I had not spoken out. And I spoke out in April 1999. And it's an interesting thing to reflect back. It is so long. It's so long ago since I spoke out. And I was convinced at the time that I'd be joined by other public office bearers in South Africa. I was a High Court judge at the time, and I was greeted with the most extraordinary response, a flood of affirmation, of approbation, of love, of loving embrace from the whole of Africa, because I'd spoken out, even though I was a white gay man, so atypical in the black African heterosexual epidemic. The response was enormously effusive and embracing. And I thought that others would join me, and it hasn't happened. It's 14 years later this month, and no other person holding public office in the entire continent of Africa has yet said that they are living with HIV. President Mandela spoke about the death of his son from AIDS in 2005 after he died. President Kaunda, other African leaders have spoken about family members of theirs who died of AIDS after their deaths. But we're still waiting for an office bearer to come out and say, I'm living with HIV. And it's the power of that stigma which has burdened so heavily the public management of the disease, and which most horrifyingly and nightmarishly manifested itself in the management of the disease by President Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, an intelligent, reflective man who styled himself as an intellectual, a man fiercely committed to what he called the rehumanization of the African after 4 centuries of degradation at the hands of people like my forebears, the white colonists of Africa, who enslaved Africans, transported them to your country, took its resources, suppressed the Africans, stigmatized them with notions of demeaning sexualities, notions of cultural inferiority. After 3 centuries, President Thabo Mbeki believed that it was time for a renaissance of the African spirit, with all the ambition and all the tragic hubris that implied. And the greatest part of the hubris was the fact that he took offense at the medical epidemiology, the demography of AIDS. He said, "Why are you telling me that alone in the world, alone on all the continents of the world, there's only one continent where there's a mass epidemic of sexual disease amongst heterosexuals? Your diagnosis, your clinical and epidemiological and social diagnosis must be racist. You're telling me that we as Africans are having sex differently from people in North America, in Asia, and in Western Europe." Well, he was tragically wrong in so many ways, because of course he over-racialized it. It wasn't a black epidemic or a continent-wide epidemic in Africa. It was a Central and Southern African epidemic, and we still don't know what is peculiar to the Bantu-speaking peoples of Central and Southern Africa, that the prevalences that we've had amongst them, 20, 30, 38% at one stage in Swaziland, a small landlocked neighbor to South Africa. What is it about them? My own belief is that medical science will still indicate that there was some physiological, probably genetic cofactor that rendered the Bantu-speaking peoples of South Africa so tremendously vulnerable, as much as the receptive partner in male-to-male insertive ejaculative intercourse. Black people in Central and Southern Africa, the same rate of transmission, unexplained. All of the theories, multiple concurrent partnerships, and I say that with particular emphasis because of the arrogance and the confidence with which that misguided theory has been propounded, they are entirely insufficient to explain what has happened in Central and Southern Africa. In West Africa, the highest national prevalence is no more than 3 or 4%. And West Africa is where all the stigmatizing conceptions of African sexuality came from, the stigmatizing conceptions that found expression in the vile racism of your region of the American South. And yet there's no generalized epidemic there. We've been waiting for it, as we waited for it in India. We've been waiting for a Nigerian epidemic, and Nigeria has far too many cases of HIV, and it's not doing very well in its management of them, but there's no mass outbreak, unlike Central and Southern Africa. And President Mbeki got that, amongst other things, desperately wrong. But the key to understanding the grievousness and the hubris of his era was that it came from stigma. It was because he thought it was shameful to say to black Africans that you're confronting a disease that is sexually transmitted. That was the key, the most tragic error that he made. And his error re-stigmatized the disease. He cast a pall over discussion of it. His own cabinet ministers couldn't say that HIV was sexually transmitted. Public discourse, he re-stigmatized the disease to an astonishing extent. If HIV was not sexually transmitted, then you didn't have to worry about sex. But most importantly, if it was not sexually transmitted, if it was, as President Mbeki maintained, an environmental phenomenon caused, as he told 15,000 of the world's scientists and AIDS carers and activists and medical doctors at the Durban conference, a disease of poverty, then antiretrovirals were a mistake. You would not administer antiretrovirals to someone whose immune system only required better nutrition, and he refused to make them available. I watched this with a measure of horror, because there was physiological and spiritual certainty in me that my life had been restored because of medical science. I'd been taking the antiretrovirals for almost 3 years at the height of President Mbeki's denialism. The Treatment Action Campaign was an organization founded to tackle the iniquities of drug pricing. And it did so gloriously, vigorously, angrily, guilefully. And that in itself is a wonderful story, ladies and gentlemen, of how a moral fabric, a moral framework of discourse about drug pricing and intellectual property was changed by the angry and resourceful activism of an organization from my continent, a black-led organization from my continent. We won that battle. And the drugs that I take today are very cheap. Drug pricing is not the major consideration in the provision of antiretrovirals in my continent. And that's because of civic organization, the agency of township activists, of on-the-street interventions by determined South Africans and Africans elsewhere. Helped, I might say, by activists in your country, importantly helped by activists in your country. The TAC, fighting this battle, suddenly found itself confronting the horror of a president who strongly believed that HIV, or was strongly skeptical whether HIV was virally transmitted, who said it was not clear that HIV had been identified. It was not clear that there was any virtue in taking an HIV test, that he didn't know anyone who had AIDS. This after some of his own closest office bearers had clearly died from the disease. And in that dark time, a time of suppressed discourse, of reinvested stigma, of the stagnation of public debate, the activists could invoke our own compact with ourselves as South Africans, our compact at the end of 3 centuries of racist subordination, a compact that said we will have a government that is committed to equality and to the dignity of its peoples. And not only a compact that limits governmental power, but a compact that says what government must do, because our Constitution is based on the premise that the distinction between the rights that come from inhibiting governmental action and those rights that come from being able to exercise the rights because of your material conditions of life, from having the minimal resources that enable you to exercise your freedom of speech and of movement and of association, of religion. Our Constitution is based on the understanding that that distinction is false. And our Constitution guarantees, amongst many social rights, the right of access to health care. And government, the Constitution says, is under an obligation to take reasonable measures within its available resources to realize the right of access to health care. And the treatment activists, when President Mbeki refused to start making antiretroviral treatment available, turned to the courts. It was an extraordinary moment. This was not a peripheral issue of social policy. This was not a question of how much to spend on highways or where to build a school. This was the keynote issue of a strong African president's authority, of his governance, the successor to Nelson Mandela. And it played out in the courtrooms of South Africa and found its way to the Constitutional Court, the court on which I am now grateful and privileged to be sitting, specially created to guard the Constitution, to safeguard the commitment to equality, to the fulfillment of human dignity in a country that had seen too much of its opposite. And the Constitutional Court was eventually called upon to decide whether President Mbeki's refusal to start making the drug available, the particular form in which the case reached it concerned the provision of nevirapine to pregnant mothers, whether that was constitutionally permissible. And the court ruled unanimously that President Mbeki's policies were not reasonable. And it issued an order requiring him to start making antiretroviral treatment available. A limited order dealing with the facts before it, but an order that portended far more. At the very time that the treatment activists had succeeded in challenging the drug companies, when your President, William Jefferson Clinton, and his foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates were negotiating with Indian drug manufacturers for dramatic cuts in drug pricing. At the very time in 2002, the synergy of a judicial decision that said that President Mbeki's policies of refusing to make the antiretroviral treatments available could not withstand constitutional scrutiny. It was an extraordinary moment for a young democracy. And it was a moment which, to President Mbeki's credit, he bowed his head. There was some talk. His health minister went onto television to say that she was not going to follow the judgment, that the court also had an obligation to listen to government because government had expertise in this area. And the very next night, the justice minister went onto television to say, that's quite wrong, we will follow the judgment. And I had the occasion recently when the justice minister, who is now retired, passed through the court and to ask him, did you do so because of a mandate from President Mbeki? And I was pleased that he confirmed that it was so. He went onto public television to acknowledge the power of law, of independent institutions, of the aspirations in a constitution that required adjudication. That is what we commit ourselves to under the rule of law and constitutionalism. The inevitability of judicial decision-making, which one does, one hopes, with humility, with information, with fairness, with impartiality, with open-mindedness. And the Constitutional Court of Judge Arthur Chaskelson embodied all those virtues richly. Its judgment led to the government 2.5 years later announcing a full program of public treatment provision of antiretrovirals. And I'm very happy to say to you that I'm now one of 2 million South Africans who are receiving antiretroviral treatment. Most of them, about 95% of them, are receiving them through the public health system. And the importance of the story lies not only in the story of non-governmental action and township street level activism. And it lies not only in the courage of the media and of the South African Council of Churches and the Congress of South African Trade Unions that aligned themselves with the Treatment Action Campaign. It lies also in the fact that President Mbeki accepted the decision and that the court's ruling as a source of reason, as a proponent of a discourse of reason, was accepted as authoritative. And that was really, I think, a pivotal moment in a quest for constitutional firmity that we had as South Africans. There have been other decisions against President Mandela when he went onto television to explain to us as South African people how important it was that the court had ruled him wrong and why he was accepting the decision. But no reverse more stinging or more feelingful than the AIDS decision. We now have a president, successor to President Mbeki, a president who's taken an HIV test publicly. We have a health minister, Dr. Edwin, who has worked in an AIDS clinic, who's held in his hands babies dying of HIV, who's nurtured people living with HIV. He understands the epidemic. He understands many public health issues and brings to them an energy and a commitment and a principled determination, which is extraordinary. The broader significance of the story also is a story about our own capacity on the African continent to make interventions, health life-saving and health-giving interventions. We were told by a health minister herself, a black woman, that black Africans couldn't take the antiretrovirals because they were too complicated, shamefully, as though any human being, especially human beings in Africa, don't understand their own best interests and the capacity for rational conduct in accordance with them. We were told that providing antiretrovirals would cripple the health system. We were told that they'd absorb money from everywhere else. The opposite has happened. The provision of antiretrovirals has alleviated the burden on the public health system. So in the end, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to come back to where I started with the paradox of this enduring aspect of stigma. Things have changed enormously. People are talking about their treatment. in the elite governing class, the judges and the businessmen and women and the bureaucrats of our new order, there is still public silence about HIV. And we know from the household surveys that this is not a working class or peasant disease. We know that it's distributed more or less equally. 10%, 10, 11% of all South Africans, black South Africans, because there's a demographic specificity for the reason that I indicated earlier, the as yet unknown reason. Black Bantu-speaking South Africans, 10 or 11% of all of them have HIV, including those in the elite. There's silence, but amongst the non-elite people, the working class people, the township people, people in rural areas, it's being much more easily spoken about. People wear the T-shirt that President Nelson Mandela donned when he went to visit Zaki Ahmed, the founder of the Treatment Action Campaign, which says, I'm HIV positive. There's a very different atmosphere, and yet stigma persists, both in the way that I've indicated amongst elite people who haven't spoken out, but also still in people who are too scared to be tested, people who are scared to come forward for treatment, for intervention, for behavior change, for prevention counseling. And of course, the heart source story there is the limits of our own capacity for rational discourse and rational action. We still have 200,000 deaths a year from AIDS in our country, a staggering figure. It's a fraction of what it would have been if we hadn't made antiretroviral treatment available. I want to end by saying that I think the story is one, as I indicated at the beginning, that engenders reflection. What is it about a virus that impelled such enormous branding, revulsion, condemnation, and judgment that skewed the public response to the epidemic in your continent, in your government, and on my continent? What is it about the power of a virus that is sexually transmitted? What is it in the nature of the sexual vector of the virus that is so powerful? I've got thoughts about that for another occasion. I think it's to do with the difficulties of the intimate engagement that sexual connection entails. A beautiful moment of shared joy, of generativity in opposite sex couples, perhaps life generativity, which instead becomes the vector for an infectious agent which may threaten your life. There's something deeply mortifying in that, which we still don't understand properly. And yet, the story also shows our own capacity through the intervention of philanthropists, through former presidents like President Clinton, the Gateses, through the intervention of angry activists on the streets, and ultimately, and very proudly for someone who, like myself, believes in the capacity of the law to guide rational human conduct, a story which offers us a way to understand that we can act better than ourselves. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you most kindly. I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to questions, ladies and gentlemen. There are microphones at the back. And Chancellor Zebos is going to put a term limit on the questions at the right time. There are microphones on that side and on this side. Now, I look forward to your questions. Sir.
You have a large number of African immigrants in your country, and I know that it's controversial as immigration is in this country. And my question is what the situation of immigrants in South Africa is vis-a-vis AIDS, and in particular, access to public health and coverage under your Constitution.
I'm so grateful you asked that question, sir. And I'm very, very pleased to tell you that our public health system doesn't even require a landed immigrant paper. You don't have to show your papers when you come with a CD4 count of less than 250. So you don't have to have a refugee status, you don't have to have permanent residence, you don't have to have a visa, you don't even have to show your passport. So of the 2 million we're treating, many are Zimbabwean, many are Botswana, many are Swazis, many are Mozambicans, many come from the rest of Africa. So I'm really pleased to be able to say that. It's one of the very fine things about our health minister, that he understands that you've got to treat everyone, as many people as you can reach. And I'm proud of that aspect of it. Thank you for asking that. Yes, sir.
Yes, my first introduction to AIDS was in the early 1970s, and I was an official in the local government, and between the police and the health department people, they were trying to shut down the gay bathhouses on the West Coast. And I really appreciate your discussion, because as somewhat of a scientist, I'm an engineer, I read all the literature in the early 70s, and it's certainly different than it is today. And I think the evolution, and the thing that bothers me the most is that, you know, India has come to Africa and has brought antivirals at a reasonable cost. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have not done so in the United States. And that's my big complaint about the United States. And we're still fighting it, and it's ridiculous. So I thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I felt educated and enumerated.
And may I say, in your criticism of the complexities and incomprehensibilities of your health system, hurrah.
It bothers me to no end.
I can only agree with you and hope to remain silent and polite. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for being here. I was in Cape Town this past summer conducting research on barriers to employment for people with disabilities, and I was told over and over again that the Constitution, because the Constitution was inclusive, that the existence of laws for further specific laws about inclusiveness didn't exist. I was wondering if you think the all-encompassing Constitution of South Africa has hindered change in any way.
I'm not entirely sure. Is the question whether the Constitution is too broad and not specific enough?
Yes. Or whether because of that, there was like, when I met with people, they would tell me, you know, because we were included in everything, so we don't need a specific law for disabilities.
But there is also a specific law, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act of 2000 actually includes a specific section on disabilities. Are you speaking about people's incapacitation subjectively because they say the Constitution's there so we don't need more specific interventions and help?
Well, I guess no specific disability act exists.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's just included in another law. So that because most laws are, I don't know, are encompassing of that.
Yes.
Yes. There's not any specific, not having like a specific disabilities act hindered change happening.
There is in fact a specific disability legislation, but you're right, there's no all-encompassing law like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there's no law that is as detailed and precise in requiring public accommodations and reasonable accommodations as the ADA does. But I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, then certainly the law, it's accepted that you're not allowed to discriminate against people with disabilities. But the practice of it, like with the prohibition on racial discrimination, the prohibition on discrimination against gays and lesbians, still falls immensely short. We have a constitution that is enormously aspirational, but we haven't yet, whether it's someone in a wheelchair or someone with a learning disability or a woman at risk of sexual violence or a gay man being dismissed, we have not, or a person still suffering race discrimination, we haven't yet fulfilled any of those ideals properly. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I'll be studying in Cape Town in the coming fall semester, and I'm particularly interested in the history, some of which you've touched on. I was wondering, to what degree, in your personal opinion, do you think that the American response to HIV in the early 80s influenced the South African response?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it mirrored it, because it mirrored the silence. For different reasons, President Mandela also kept silent, not because he condemned. He's not a bigoted person, and he doesn't have any anti-gay or anti-lesbian feelings, but he had 999 other things to do. And for him, as an African patriarch who'd spent 27 years, including the generations of sexual revolution in jail, for him it was very difficult to address these issues. So the parallels were striking. The first time President Mandela mentioned the disease was in a speech in February 1997, and it wasn't even in South Africa, it was at Davos, Switzerland. So for 3 years he kept quiet, not dissimilarly to President Reagan, although for very different reasons. President Mandela's hour of extraordinary intervention came after he stepped down as president, when he made it increasingly clear that he would speak out for antiretroviral treatment, even though his successor, President Mbeki, his visit to Zaki Ahmed, he's putting on the shirt and his propounding of the value of antiretroviral treatments was a clear challenge to the denialist flirtation and advocacy of President Mbeki. But certainly the public responses found many echoes 10 years later. The uncertainty, the falling around, the stigma, the difficulty of talking plainly about prevention, about transmission, very similar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
It's been great to see that there's been so much accomplishment made in providing treatment for those who have already been infected with HIV, but I was wondering if there was anything similar accomplished for preventing the further spread of the virus?
It's such a good question, because one of the most intractable areas of the debate about AIDS is about prevention. And there have been many, many campaigns. You can distinguish awareness, knowledge, and capacity for action. There's 100% awareness of HIV in my country. Everyone knows about it. You wouldn't find a person in any village or any suburban household or township home who doesn't know about AIDS. Knowledge is also very high, very, very high. In the 90s, people know perfectly well how you can and can't get HIV. They know that sexual intercourse, unprotected sexual intercourse, is the big danger. The capacity for action in a gendered society, in a society that is resource poor, in a society where people are living in circumstances when they wouldn't be able to dispose of condoms. They're sleeping 9 or 10 couples to a room. How do you use a condom to dispose of it afterwards? That's very different. So prevention is foregrounded, but the capacity for implementing it is very difficult. And I also like to remind people that asking people to change their behavior is a very difficult thing. You know that almost 1 in 5 Americans still smokes, even though it's 60 years since the studies started showing the link between cancer and smoking, and 50 years since the governments of North America and Western Europe engaged in anti-smoking campaigns. So if you've halved 44% of Americans in 1960, 18 or 19% now, I think those figures are right. So it's taken 50 years to get 55 or 60% of smokers proportionately to stop smoking. So much stronger is the drive for sexual connection that I don't find it at all surprising that prevention is such a difficult thing to do. And I have a personal reason for saying that, of course, as well. I speak with mortification when I speak of prevention, because at the time I was infected, in I think Easter 1985, I knew about HIV. I was a politically conscious gay man who thought I would get away with it. So when I speak to school kid audiences in Soweto or elsewhere, I don't speak with any sense of superiority or sanctimony. Thank you.
George Jogans, the last question.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for coming. Yesterday and today, we had some wonderful discussions. Bishop Tutu was here about 7, 8 years ago. And my question actually relates to the reconciliation approach that was used. Could you just tell us briefly how that came about and what was the motivation for it and what facilitated it as a member of the law? And then second, did it have any effect at all on the acceptance of individuals who are HIV positive?
Well, Professor Hill's just, Chancellor Zebas, I'm going to keep you for the next hour. It's a very difficult question. May I ask you, many thanks, Professor Hill. The Truth and Reconciliation process was an incomplete, partial, and partly unsuccessful, but nevertheless extraordinary process in my country, chaired by this astonishingly spiritual, astonishingly secular man, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the objective of the TRC process was, it was in parallel with our Constitution. Our Constitution expressly commits itself to being transformational, transformative, to saying we come from a past of injustice. We come from a past of institutionalized, structuralized injustice. We can't say that there's fairness for everyone or that we're going to guarantee equal rights because we don't have equality structurally and substantively and materially. And alongside that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission likewise looked at the past and said we must acknowledge the human rights abuses, the perpetrators of violations, of gross human rights violations on both sides. So perpetrators from the ANC as well as from the apartheid government were enabled to come forward and to seek amnesty. There was a reparations process, which is probably the least satisfactory part of it. But despite everything that one can say about how incomplete it was, how unsatisfactory it was, I think nevertheless it was indispensable to our country's transition. I think nevertheless, because of the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and I would say also it's a racially specific statement and a culturally specific statement. I would say that the great benefit we've had in South Africa is not only the caliber of the leaders of Nelson Mandela and his generation, not just he himself, but Walter Sisulu and Desmond Tutu and others, but also a tolerant generosity in the African cultures, the same Bantu-speaking cultures. There's a word of Ubuntu which says that my functioning and fulfillment as a human being is dependent on my capacity, on my interconnection with other human beings. And I think we've been very fortunate that people in South Africa weren't as vengeful, angry, unforgiving. It really astonishes me, and I don't say this sentimentally, I say this entirely practically and pragmatically. It actually astonishes me how forgiving black South Africans have been. So we've benefited in both those ways, from the visionary leadership and from the fact that, and I think from a functional perspective as well, that black South Africans have seen that diversity is an enhancement and a strength, and that we need each other. The whites need the blacks and the black. We all need each other in all our diversities. I don't think that, I can't think of any, I've never had that question before, Professor Hill. I can't think of any direct way in which it played into the HIV, and I don't even think that in the TRC report, which was handed over in 1998 or 1999, I don't even think that HIV is mentioned. But now that you've asked that, I'll go back and look. But I can't think of any ways. It's an interesting question, though, and I hope that someone's going to set a very clever Vanderbilt major the essay of thinking of how the reconciliation process might have had an interrelation to the stigmatizing process which was occurring at the time of the epidemic. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Chancellor Zebas. Thank you.